Well, thank you everyone for being here, and for thanks to VRBP for inviting me. It's a pleasure always to be in the Verde Valley. I really enjoy working here, and the more I get to know the diverse crowd that's interested in water issues here, the more exciting it is. I see a lot of new faces and a lot of very familiar faces, and I have to say I don't know if I've ever been in a more diverse audience than this, all the way from very veteran water buffaloes and hydrology professors to Canadian geography teachers. It's awesome. So my presentations are generally, for audiences like this, tend to be not super technical, trying to reach everybody who's sitting here. So if something's way over your head and I can't explain it in a minute or two, we'll just move on and I'll try to summarize it. So don't hesitate to ask, but I don't want to get too bogged down in the weeds either. We don't want to, we can do that later, anytime. But for today, we're talking about big picture stuff, more of a 15,000 foot level conversation about the Verde and how we use this tool called the Groundwater Model to explore potential futures for the Verde Valley and the Upper Verde Basin. So the title of the talk, as Ed said, is Exploring the Potential Impacts of Future Growth on Groundwater and Surface Water Resources in the Verde Basin. So the key word here is future. I'm going to talk a lot about future. And I heard some sort of excellent leading comments about alternative things that could affect the future, like conservation, for example. So we'll go into some of these options. This is my information. If you need to speak to me later, I can give you a card. We can email, call me, whatever. But yeah, I want you to be able to contact me. I want to acknowledge my colleagues at the town of Clarkdale who have been so gracious in supporting my work over the last 2 years. Funding from the Walton Family Foundation has also been a really big part of why this work is happening. A lot of it started, well, it has all started with a Clarkdale Water Resources Study, and I think most of you know where Clarkdale is. Canadian might not know, but it's up the valley. It's a little tiny town, but with a very big sustainability agenda. And so this study was sort of the first practical implementation of the NARGFM model. We use it to try to understand the regional and local groundwater and surface water dynamics of the Verde Valley area in particular. And we're using it now to look at how regional growth might impact that dynamic over time, all with the goal of estimating Clarkdale's own impacts on the river and trying to come up with a suite of options for future water resources management to accommodate their sustainability goals as well as growing their economy. So all of it is wrapped up in future planning and trying to understand what future impacts would be with and without certain actions. Here's a picture of the cover of the NARGFM Groundwater Model publication from the USGS. Came out in 2010, I believe, yeah. It is not called the Northern Arizona Regional Groundwater Flow Model, but that's what we call it. It has a very long title, Regional Groundwater Flow Model of the Redwall, Moave, Coconino, and Alluvial Basin Aquifer Systems of Northern and Central Arizona. Like all groundwater models, this model can do some things and it can't do some things. So if you're not familiar with groundwater modeling, I just want to point out a few things that the model can do. It can be used to predict impacts of pumping on groundwater levels. It can also estimate the amount of stream flow that's captured by groundwater pumping wells. And it can explore the effects of climate on aquifers, springs, and streams. So those are some things it can do. What it cannot do is simulate storm runoff. So the big floods that we were just hearing about on March 3rd are not individually represented in this kind of modeling. The cumulative effect of hundreds of years of flooding and recharge through natural systems is represented. But individual storm events are not represented. These are long-term periods that we're talking about, a minimum time step of about 1 to 5 years. And so in talking about stream flow, we're not talking about total stream flow. This is the numbers you see here are not the same as the gauging station numbers that you would see on USGS website, because we're only talking about the piece of the stream that is supported by groundwater flow. So when you hear me say base flow, I'm talking about a piece of the stream flow that's in the river all the time in a system that's supported by groundwater. So that's why we're worried about pumping insofar as it may subtract some water from the stream. It may intercept it, or it may actually capture it directly from the stream. That's the connection between groundwater pumping and base flow, and that's what we're looking at here today. Just a map of the reach of this enormous groundwater model. It basically covers all of northern Arizona and a little bit of New Mexico. You know, that's a very, very, very large area for groundwater. And you're not going to be able to see this at all, but we're essentially right here in this little circle. So yeah, very big model, very small study area relative to the model size, but that's okay. We can still use it to study this area in the scale that we're talking about. You know, the upper basin of the Verde and the Verde Valley area combined, that's still a fairly large area, and it's a suitable area to use this great big model on. The inputs to a groundwater model consist of a few key things: soil and rock properties, of course. You know, what kind of aquifer material are we talking about? Is it transmissive? Is it very dense? Is it fractured? Historic water levels. So if some of you have wells that have been around for a long time and anyone has monitored those water levels over the past 50 to 70 years, you know, that kind of information is very, very important for groundwater modeling to try to understand the relationship between stresses in the outside, like climate and pumping, versus the resulting water levels in the aquifer. Spring flow measurements, stream flow measurements for base flow periods. So we're talking mostly about maybe June, October, those areas, those periods of the record. And then new stresses. And this is the part where I come in. This is a model that already exists. It was built by the USGS with all the information that was available up to 2006. From that time forward, it's a new day. We have new stresses to put in the model. We have to talk about climate. What is the climate and how is that impacting natural recharge in the model? And we have to talk about stresses like pumping. How is that going to change over time? So once you put things into the model, you do get some outputs, and those are basically predicted future values. And those include groundwater levels, stream base flows, spring flows, and changes in inflow and outflow to the groundwater system. So I'm going to spend just a moment talking about CYHWRMS because I know most of you know it inside and out better than I do, but not everyone does. So I just want to explain what is CYHWRMS and why are we even talking about it today. First of all, I'll say that the Central Yavapai Highlands Water Resources Management Study was a very big effort, and one of the key experts in that effort is sitting right here in the audience. So if you have questions, ask Jean Marie Haney.
There's several other secretaries.
But really, I am not an expert in CYHWRMS, so please forgive me if I am not super clear on things, but we are just focusing on one element of it today, and that is captured here in this purpose statement that I got from the Yavapai WAC website the other day. It says the study will, this was written, you know, as a precursor to the study. The study will identify projected water use needs and then outline water resources management and management strategies to the defined future needs of communities in the Central Yavapai Highlands. So really today we're focused on this element here, projected water use needs. So here's a map of the study area, and this is where being in the back row is not going to be helpful. I'm going to try to just point out a few. This is the Prescott AMA. Here we are in Cottonwood, Camp Verde here, Sedona. This is the Big Chino up here, the Ash Fork CDP, I believe it's called. Williamson Valley, Chino Valley, Paulden, Prescott, Prescott Valley, Dewey, Humboldt. So these are all individual study areas that were used to project population and future demand by the CYHWRMS study group. And that's what we're really focused on today. How is pumping going to change in each one of these study areas over time? Not just pumping, but also recharge, artificial recharge. So for the purposes of my conversation today, this is the upper basin. I know there are many different ways of talking about this, but for our purposes today, there's a dividing line around here. Basically, this yellow section is the Mingus Mountain study area. That is included in the lower part, but the upper part is everything this side of that dividing line. And we're calling everything on the east side the Verde Valley. So that includes the Mingus Mountain CCD, even though it's split kind of down the middle here by the AMA. So Sedona, Cottonwood, Clarkdale, Jerome, they're all in the Verde Valley planning area.
Question?
Please.
Yes.
How does the water from Big Chino get to the Verde Valley? Is that via the Verde River? Is that it?
Yeah, there's the Verde River is part of both basins. So its headwaters are in the upper basin. Now there are some complications with groundwater communication between the two. Let's just leave it there for the moment.
Question, how does it get across the mountain? Or is it
Oh, well, so there's a valley here. This is the river. Here's the river path, starting above really the study area, traveling through the upper basin, and then coming in to meet Sycamore Canyon here at the Clarkdale gauge, and then flowing through the Verde Valley. Is that clear? Okay. Thank you for that question. Okay, so now this is total gobbledygook. It's not important, but this is the main heart of the study that we're talking about today. So I'm just going to show you some nice arrows, and that's all you need to know. The CYHWRMS study, this table was from the Phase 1 demands estimate part of the study. So the real key here is 2050 population. That's in the study area. These are the study areas, okay? So Camp Verde, Dewey, Humboldt, Clarkdale, so forth, all the way down Ash Fork, including upper and lower basin. Here's 2006 population and 2050 population. This right here is sort of the focal point of the entire CYHWRMS planning element. So what is this 2050 population? It's anyone. We're going to believe CYHWRMS guess for today. So there's some population change, and then they come and decide a few categories in which to discuss demand. So we have 2050 population and 2050 GPPD, gallons per person per day. Those are the two really key numbers in this table. With that, started out with 2006 demands, and they're broken into municipal, domestic, commercial, industrial, and agricultural demands. And here's a total. So that's 2006 values. And from there, we get to 2050 demand values, all by going from 2006 population to 2050 population, and by going from 2006 GPPD to 2050 GPPD. Now, there's some magic that happens in here. Some communities, every community has its own estimate for how its gallons per person per day consumption will change over time. And that is reflected here in these numbers. So I don't know who came up with these numbers, but someone from each community did. And so, for example, some of them, like in Chino Valley, expect that their GPPD will decline over time from 93 to 75 from 2006 to 2050. Others estimate, like Cottonwood Verde Village, estimate that theirs will increase from 31 to 125 in that same time period. I'm not questioning or judging any of these numbers. I'm just telling you what's in the study because that's what we're using. So that is this is the translation from 2006 demand to 2050 demand is all based on this conversion from 2006 gallons per person per day to 2050 gallons per person per day and the population that's expected to be there in 2050. Okay, so this somehow then has to go into the model. This is my job, is to take this gobbledygook and translate it into something meaningful. No, so really the first step that I have to take is looking at the groundwater model, which does not have CYHWRMS study areas built into it. It just has pumping wells that exist today in the ground and have existed in the past. Those are just there. So I have to take that pretty map of the CYHWRMS study areas and sort of isolate the wells that fit into each one of these planning areas and try to understand what the demand is in the model versus what CYHWRMS says it is in 2006. So here's an example for the Upper Verde Basin. 2006 municipal domestic demand. The blue is what CYHWRMS says the demand is. The red is what I identified as the municipal domestic demand in the model, just with the wells that were in the model, and me trying to sort out which wells go in which study area and so forth. So a little overestimating probably, maybe in the model for 2006 demand in the upper basin. Commercial industrial demand very low in both areas. These two columns together add up to this third column, which is total non-ag demand for 2006. This is ag demand for 2006, so less in the model than what's in CYHWRMS. And this is the sum of total non-ag and total ag together. And interestingly, the differences here and here are balanced in the end, and so the total demand for the upper basin is almost exactly the same in the model as on paper in CYHWRMS, which is a miracle, right? That was not expected. So we'll talk about these numbers in more detail later, but I just want to show you kind of what the starting point is. And as I said, the upper basin, you know, we had that map up a minute ago, and I don't know if you noticed, but certain study areas like Chino Valley, there was a nice pink section in the middle of the upper basin. It has a little green section in the middle of it, which is also part of the Prescott study area. It's very hard in a model with resolution of 1 square kilometer grid to discern which wells belong in which study area. It's very difficult to do with the data that I had to work with. So many intertwining study areas makes for complicated accounting on the CYHWRMS study area basis. If we look at the lower basin, the number's a little different. This is the Verde Valley. So again, 2006 municipal domestic demand is pretty well matching here, and this is not exactly an accident. I did some adjustments here because I've been working on this section of the model for a while. So these numbers are quite close. Commercial industrial, we're still lacking some commercial production rates in the model relative to what was published in the 2006 CYHWRMS study. This could be that we just don't know what they are. Some of them are not reported. It could be that the model just doesn't have them in there. So these two columns together add up to this. So there is a slight underreporting of demand in the Verde Valley in the NARGFM relative to the 2006 demands in the CYHWRMS study. Ag demand is completely different. Why? Because there's surface water diversions in the valley. Those are not part of the groundwater model. So you will not see surface water diversions accounted for here in the model. If you add up these two columns, you get total demand, and this difference is all about ag. Primarily, it's a reflection, this mismatch is a reflection of surface water diversions in the valley. So we're not talking about that here today. We're only talking about any ag that we talk about is groundwater pumped agriculture, okay? Groundwater irrigated agriculture. Okay, now how do we go from CYHWRMS population and demand to pumping and put it in the model? So these are right out of the CYHWRMS table, blown up a little bit, but basically this is for every study area in CYHWRMS. 2006 non-agricultural demand here, 2050 non-agricultural demand here, and the multiplier. So basically, if you multiply 2006 demand by 1.49, you get 2050 demand here. And I did that for each one of these study areas. And these numbers range from 0.55 to 13.77. It's different for every single study area. Okay, so that's why we have to account for the pumping study area by study area, because each one of them has a different projected growth rate. So this is a key factor. This is the way that I take 2006 pumping values in the NARGFM and grow them up to 2050 values and beyond. I basically just use these numbers as multipliers. And then, sorry, I'm walking back and forth. I just wanted to point out for agricultural demand, there's also an equation here. Now, CYHWRMS says that agricultural demand will be declining over time. And that can be expected, right? As urbanization takes place, there'll be less farming, more houses. So for each one of the study areas, it also has a projected change in agricultural demand. For example, Camp Verde, 2006 ag demand was 9,320, declining to 6,213, and this is a decline of 0.33. We're talking about trying to look at groundwater here, so it's not always simple to discern groundwater from surface water in some of these numbers. But for each study area, we had a prescribed decline rate from 2006 to 2050 for agricultural use. Wanted to point out an outlier again, Cottonwood Verde Village, has this really high growth rate compared to all the rest. We talked about that a minute ago. That's just one example, but 13.77 here. Big Park over near Sedona has an exceptionally high declining rate for agricultural use. They basically are going to get rid of all agricultural water use by 2050. So that rate is 100% decline instead of like a 33% decline like most of the rest. So there are some differences. So then I take those numbers, those factors, and plug them into the model. Here are the study areas, here are the factors. Here is this factor, instead of being on a 50-year basis or 46-year basis, it's on a daily basis. I've calculated it, just divided it by time. So this is a daily rate of increase. Then I can take pumping for each stress period in the model. There's 17 stress periods, but we started in stress period 11. That's the 2000 to 2016 period. We use a multiplier for all the days in that period, and then increase it again in the next period and so forth until we get out to 2076, which is the end of the model simulation period. So right in this column here, this is the 2046 to 2056 model period. That straddles that 2050 number that we're looking for in CYHWRMS, right? So the 2050 demand in CYHWRMS is close to the value that straddles the 2046 to 2056 period here. Yes?
How do you calculate the increase in the stress?
Okay, so I have numbers for 2006. That was the end of the NARGFM study calibration period. I take those change factors that were in CYHWRMS. The demand goes from 2006 to 2050. And I just say, what is that multiplier that you multiply 2006 numbers by to get 2050 numbers? And for each study area, I use that multiplier to calculate an increased pumping rate so that it's a linear projection all the way from here to here. And then I just extend it out 25 more years.
You distribute that evenly across all the wells in that study?
In that study area, yes. All wells in a study area are treated the same. When we move to the next study area, they get a new multiplier. Okay. And again, this is just to show you this particular number for Cottonwood Verde Villages was 13.77 in the last slide. It's 14.09 here. It's a little different because we're straddling a 10-year period. So I lumped it basically as an average value for the upper basin because we still, even if we're concerned about what's happening in Clarkdale, we need to know what's happening at least on a bulk scale in the upper part of the basin in the future. Question? Okay. So these are what those multipliers look like over time. And just understand that these are linear projections from 2006 to 2076. That 2050 period is right in here. So this is the CYHWRMS. This is a multiplier that CYHWRMS allowed me to calculate. And here's the outlier of Cottonwood Verde Village, for example. Here's Clarkdale. And all the rest sort of go from 0 to 4 in 65 years, whatever it is, 60 years. No, 70 years, 2006 to 2076. And this is declining ag pumping here. So again, most of the values in the Verde Valley fall along this trajectory at a decline of about 33% over 2006 to 2050. This is the upper basin value. And this is the Big Park value. A steeper decline because they're dropping to 0 sooner than the rest. Okay, so that's the meat of it. Those are the mechanisms by which we get a future pumping value to put into the model. Okay, so now that we have future pumping values, we want to know how that compares with some other alternative future. And the other alternative future we're going to talk about today is no growth. Basically holding everything constant from here on out. If Tony stops pumping, someone else comes in and pumps the same amount that he left behind. That's the way it's going to work here. Even if population dynamics change, the pumping stays the same. Okay, so what does a CYHWRMS future look like in terms of the simulations today? It has some future climate. One of the inputs, bless you. one of the model inputs is climate. We have to know how much natural water is recharging the system. And that is anyone's guess. It's as difficult to predict as population, if not more so. But we have a fair idea that maybe it'll be less recharged than we've seen in recent history. So we'll talk about how to come up with that value here. We will see increased non-agricultural pumping over time, increasing wastewater recharge over time as those municipalities are getting more water through their pipes into their wastewater systems. They have to do something with it. We're assuming it's going to recharge. So that is proportional to increased use. Golf course pumping is one thing that will not change in this scenario. The CYHWRMS study doesn't talk about any changes in golf course consumption over time, so we're assuming that pumping stays static, as does the related incidental recharge. And then agricultural pumping and incidental recharge will also decline over time. What about a no-growth future? Well, that's kind of simple, right? We still have to have a climate. We're going to use the same climate information in both scenarios. There won't be any increased non-ag pumping. There won't be any increased wastewater recharge. There will be static golf course pumping, and there will not be any decline in agricultural pumping or incidental recharge. So all pumping and recharge just remain static from 2006 to 2076. Okay, so even though some people aren't comfortable with it, I sort of call this, the spectrum of opportunity. If the population can grow, but pumping and recharge stayed at today's rate, that's kind of the no-growth scenario. So maybe we get more efficient, but we're still producing water and consuming it at the same rate as today. And then the other option is we continue to use water at high rates, similar to today or maybe even higher, and we grow the population. And that's what leads to that CYHWRMS scenario. Okay, let's talk about climate for just a moment. I don't have to tell you guys that this is a very controversial subject and very poorly understood in many ways. So one thing that we decided to do in Clarksville work is to just look back in the historic record. And this is a common approach. The historic record we have is about 100 years, and it contains some pretty radical episodes of dry times and wet times. And we've just recently been through a wet time from about 1977 to 1998. This is a recharge factor graph. Ignore that word for a moment and just think about this as sort of paralleling precipitation. So this period here from 1977 to 1990, roughly, 95, pretty wet period compared with the previous 70 years and compared with the next couple of decades here, 2000 to 2016 is represented here by these. Well, there was a very wet 20 or 30 year period from about 1977 to about 1998. And that varied in the Southwest a little bit, but that all across the Southwest, there was a strong El Nino dominated period. And so recharge was estimated to be quite high during those couple of decades. But before that, it was considerably drier. And now we know from what we've experienced in the last 15, 16 years that it has been much drier than that. Since 2000, things have dried out a lot. So that's why the recharge factor drops down here to 2016. And then what we're going to do is just say, the historic record has a good amount of variability in it. Why don't we just repeat the first 60 years, from 1910 to 1970, and just put that in the end of the model period that we're talking about today. So we just take this pattern here and flop it on the future end of the simulation. So from 2016, we have roughly this information already. This is new information in the model, but we're considering the historic record here. So what happens if we put this same pattern of recharge out into the future again, repeating what's already happened? Well, what that does, it decreases the mean recharge value over time by about 9%. So the black line is average recharge from 1910 to 2006 when the NARGFM was published. But if you calculate a new average considering this entire time period from 1910 to 2076, that mean drops by about 9%. And that 9% value, it indicates that we're going to see somewhat drier conditions. It also corresponds well to an estimate from the Bureau of Reclamation for the Colorado River Basin study that they released a couple of years ago, estimating a 9% decline in base flows at Lee's Ferry on the Colorado River. So there's some justification for using this type of future for the simulations at hand here. We're not pulling anything out of thin air. It's just simply saying, what if we go back to a pattern like we had before the wet period?
You're saying that there is something cyclic about this in 20 years or something of that nature?
Well, there has been in the past. Yeah. I think we're in an area of time now where people will say the past is not necessarily a good indication of the future anymore. We may be departing from that kind of periodicity, but we can say that for sure we're in a drying cycle right now, and we don't know how long it will last. Dry compared with the last 30 years before that.
Well, you're talking about the heat now too. It's a big controversial area.
Right, so exactly. And so this recharge number is not precipitation. It's actually how much water makes it from the atmosphere into the groundwater system. So it incorporates also increased temperature. If it could either be through less precipitation or more precipitation and higher temperatures. Whatever combination happens to occur, less of that water will get into the groundwater system and support base flows.
One quick comment.
Yes.
The water that runs off, are there some? I see some areas where they gather the water. Does that move down in and enrich the aquifer?
In some cases it can, and we'll talk about that more later.
More can be done in that regard?
Yes, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so just a graphical representation of the CYHWRMS future and the no growth future in terms of the model's perception. So this is 2000 to 2014 roughly in here, and from here out steady growth with CYHWRMS. This is the upper basin curve, and this is the Verde Valley curve. The flat lines are the no growth curves, and so this is total pumping for both of those areas. Okay. When you have a pumping well that pumps for a long time, sometimes you run into problems. Sometimes the aquifer is insufficient to be able to continue to supply water to that well at the same rate forever and ever and ever. Wells dry up. And this is already happening in parts of the Verde Valley. It's definitely not controversial to say that. It's happened. What do you do when your well dries up? You have two options. You can either deepen it or you can move it. So in this model, it's reflecting reality. In many cases, I could not run the CYHWRMS demand out to 2076 without having to deepen or move several wells. The model told me that the ground was dry, the aquifer was dry, and I needed to do something else with these wells. So instead of just leaving it like that, if you have a groundwater modeling well, a well that's in your model and it dries up the cell that it's pumping from, that means that pumping is no longer occurring in the model, and that's not reflecting the growth that we want to show. So in order to maintain this growth rate of pumping over time, sometimes I had to move wells from one place to another to ensure that the pumping was still occurring in the model. So that is a fairly involved process. It takes a lot of trial and error. So it involves deepening and moving. And first attempt was always to deepen in the same location. If that didn't work, I would try to move it to another location within the study area. If that didn't work, I moved it outside the study area.
Do you have an idea of how frequent that happened and when it started to happen? And whether it increased in frequency?
Well, it's different for every location. Okay, it's really site specific because some areas of the aquifer, it depends on the thickness of the aquifer, the transmissivity, and the rate of pumping. Okay, all these variables. So it's impossible to generalize about that. I mean, some areas are seeing it happen today. Clarkdale has some very at-risk pumping in their area that's going to have to be diverted to other wells. So, boy, that feels like the heater coming on.
Hopefully it's the air conditioner.
Okay, so I just wanted to give you an example of what it looks like in the model. My apologies to those of you in the nosebleed section. But this is just a little blow up of what I see on my screen when I run this computer model and I look at a map of the study areas. This is the Sedona study area. This is the Big Park study area. And what I see here in layer 2, at the end of my simulation in 2076, I see a lot of little red triangles right here. What that means is a dry cell. Each red triangle is a dry cell. It used to be a pumping well, now it's dry, it's inactive. So if I want to maintain pumping in the Big Park area, I have to do something to change this. This means no pumping is happening here. That's not reflecting what I want my simulation to look like. So this is layer 2. The model has 3 layers. The top layer, middle layer is layer 2, and the bottom layer is layer 3. Most wells in this model are either in layer, I shouldn't say most wells, the largest production wells in the Clarkdale area, in Cottonwood, they're mostly in layers 2 and 3. There are some layer 1 wells, but they're small. It's a small area of layer 1. So anyway, this is layer 2. If I want to deepen a well, I have to put it into layer 3. So I tried putting it in layer 3, and basically, this is the original layer 3 configuration of wells. They were all still in the Big Park area. I tried deepening them.
What were your thresholds for considering a well a large production well?
Oh, it's just a rough, my sense of something large. A non-exempt well, for example. Okay. What would be a non-exempt well? So now what I had to do is, this is the modified layer 2 well placement. Basically, the wells are still here in layer 2, but I took some of the pumping from many of these wells and I moved it to layer 3, but I had to move it outside of the Big Park study area because I could not put it anywhere in the Big Park study area and still sustain the pumping that I needed to without drying up the model. So in this particular case, some wells here had to be moved outside the study area. I also made some adjustments to reflect what seemed to be some error in the model about conductivity rates there. And this is a difficult area to model. It's just an example of how I manipulated the wells in the model to make sure we kept pumping at the rate we were planning to pump. Yes?
How deep are the wells?
Oh, they vary a lot. I mean, hundreds of feet deep. The same thing happened in the Chino Valley, Prescott area. There were many dry cells in layer 2. I tried deepening those many times. That was unsuccessful. And so guess what? You've been waiting for this. Here's the dry cells. Oops. And so this is, let me back up. Well, layer 2 dry cells, layer 3 new wells. It was, I could have kept trying to poke new holes in the new straws in this pool down here, but everywhere I looked, it wouldn't work. So eventually I just said I'm going to put them up here because I know that this is where pumping will be sustainable. And so, there's a reason why people are looking at the Big Chino. Yes?
Is just drilling wells and noting the flow or not flow, this is the only source of your data, or is there some geological technique that the petroleum companies are using to send a card like Schlumberger, that sort of thing, and get a better, more finer display or presentation of data, or source of data?
Well, it's all generalized right now. I mean, it's all based on exact locations of wells, but they are generalized into 1 kilometer grid cells for the purposes of simulation. So it looks very basic here, but it does incorporate 17,000 wells are represented in this model. So I'm not sure what you're getting at, but we should move on and talk about that later. Well, I don't necessarily know, but I'm taking what's published by the USGS in that regard. Okay, so there could be errors in the representation that the model uses. I mean, all models are wrong, okay? Nobody knows exactly what's underground everywhere. But we use the data we have based on historic pumping, and the location of wells today indicates that there's groundwater there. We know that. But where they're going to go in the future and what those production rates might look like in places that haven't been pumped at those rates before is a little bit unknown. So yeah, there's a lot of guesswork, estimated, educated guessing that has to go into building a model like this. But it is the best information available.
Is there any technology from satellites and other kind of?
There's gravity, remote sensing. There are techniques that have been used to estimate sort of the transmissibility of the ground as well as the depth to bedrock, for example. There are several techniques that are used to do that. I mean, this is all a general representation of very, very detailed information in some areas and lack of information completely in other areas. One thing that we don't know much about is how ephemeral stream channels work. You know, we know they get a lot of water at certain times. Very briefly, we don't know the fate of that water, how fast it infiltrates, how much it gets to the aquifer in a certain amount of time. That's what SRP is working on with their photography. So that's an important piece of information that will help the next generation of groundwater modeling. Anyway, I don't want to get too bogged down here, but what we're looking at is how do these future pumping rates and under this climate scenario affect groundwater levels and stream flows in the future. So we're going to zoom in on this section of our CYHWRMS map right now because this is primarily the Verde River here is the area that's primarily seeing impacts from this future pumping. So if we zoom in, and this is a bit of a messy diagram here, but just for your reference, this is the Chino Valley study area, Prescott Valley, Jerome, Clarkdale, Camp Verde, Sedona. Okay, so for your reference. And here is the model's depiction of changes, just changes in stream base flow over time from 2006 to 2076 with no growth. Okay, so even though we're not growing pumping, we have pumping continuing at today's rates a long time. Okay, so those impacts, if we could hold pumping steady today for 70 more years, we would still see declines in the river. Part of this decline is climate too. It incorporates that. But a large part of it is pumping, and you can see that in sort of the difference in color from light blue, which is the sort of lowest impact areas, to medium blue, to green and yellow and red in some areas. The warmer the color, the higher the impact. Yes?
Is one of those red squares the Camp Verde gauge?
No, well, actually, Camp Verde gauge is right off the map here, conveniently. These are 1 kilometer grid cells. You need to take these numbers with a grain of salt, but the important point here is that there are changes that are definitely communicating pumping effects to base flows. And this is happening without any future growth. Okay, so these numbers are not exact for each reach in the river. You're not going to find exactly 30 CFS or 50 CFS of change in the next 60 years, but you can see that the changes here are going to be slighter than the changes here, primarily because there's a whole lot more water down here to capture. It's easier for wells to access this water too. Okay, so that's the no growth scenario. Now keep this picture in mind, and we will flash to the. Oh, the scale. Yeah. So this is 5 CFS decline, and this is 50. That's not the highest number. The numbers go up to close to 100 CFS in the southern end of the model. So these are declines, and this is with the CYHWRMS growth scenario. Okay, so we can go back and forth and have a look at that again. If I can figure out how to do this. All right. No, it can't be done. Huh, yeah, keyboard. Okay, no growth. CYHWRMS growth. No growth, CYHWRMS growth. Okay, you get the picture. It's a much more intense effect on the river because there's much more pumping going on. If we look at the effects of CYHWRMS, just the effects of the CYHWRMS growth, okay, subtracting out all the no growth stuff, just looking at the difference between the two, here's what it looks like. So basically today there's no change because we haven't started the CYHWRMS growth yet, but here we go up to 2026. 2036, 2046, 2056, 2066, 2076. So that's just sort of the steady march down that road of increased impacts on the river. Yes, Jean Marie?
Outside of the CYHWRMS study area you're working with, did you run the model with just static?
Yes. Everything outside the CYHWRMS study area was held constant after 2006.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I see your scale changed. Is there a reason for that? The red's now 30.
Yes, there is a reason, because we're only looking at the difference between the two, not the total value. Okay, so the previous thing was looking at total change from 2006 to 2076 in each scenario. Now I'm just subtracting those two scenarios, so the number is smaller. Okay, does that make sense? We had the CYHWRMS change and the no growth change, and now I'm just showing you the difference between them. Okay, so this scale is, yeah, this is now like 4 to 32 instead of 5 to 50 as it was before. But these are the changes due strictly to CYHWRMS growth. So what this shows you is, you know, the places of intense growth, you see some intense impacts. Yeah. Okay. All right, now we'll just take a look at the other output from the model of significance, which is groundwater level changes. So with no growth, you see some nice bright spots here. The sort of background blue means very little change. The warmer colors, this is going from -2 feet to over 50 feet. The warmer the colors, the more groundwater decline over time. So again, we're looking at 2006 to 2076 with no growth, but with ongoing pumping at today's rates. You see red spot in Clarkdale. We know we've got issues there. Red spot up here in the Upper Chino, and lots of sort of light blue smearing where the effects are more distributed. What you don't see is a lot of change happening along Big Chino Wash in this scenario. Okay, there's not a lot of pumping going on if you just leave all the wells the way they are today. This bright spot is a recharge area that's seeing declining recharge over time, so that's why it's changing, its head is dropping, not because of pumping. Okay, now if we switch to CYHWRMS, you see a lot more brightness, a lot bigger red spots, and brightness up here in the Big Chino because new wells have been put in there. So now we'll do the same thing as before and subtract the CYHWRMS, or subtract the no growth from CYHWRMS and look at just the difference between the two and how that looks in terms of groundwater effects. So this is ending in 2026, 2036, 2046, 2056, 66, and 2076. And so you can really see this plume of groundwater impact migrating up the Big Chino because of this replacement of pumping that couldn't go on any longer here with wells up in here. Okay. Okay, I'm going to take a breath here. I said these are preliminary results. They are. When you see something published in paper that doesn't say preliminary on it, then you can quote me on it. For now, these are early results. But these results represent a range of futures for the Verde Basin. Okay, doesn't mean this is what's happening. We don't know which one of these is closer to reality. You've seen sort of the window of possibilities between holding pumping constant at today's rate and doing basically nothing and letting things kind of go wild into the future. Maybe growth won't happen at that rate anyway, but there's a possibility that it would. So, but what's important to remember is that these results are futures without any intervention. Okay, there's no change in management practice incorporated into these simulations. It just means we're either using water at one rate or another, but there's really no change in the way the water is manipulated. Okay, so this is just sort of cycling through that evolution from the no growth to the CYHWRMS growth possibility. You can see whatever changes you see in this animation are strictly a function of that growth, that difference between no growth and CYHWRMS growth. That means that every change you see happening in the groundwater system here could be avoided by not changing anything about the way pumping happens in this basin for the next 70 years. You could avoid those changes. You can't avoid the no growth changes. Those would still happen. But there's a lot of change happening here that's associated with a high growth scenario like CYHWRMS. So we have, you've seen this before, but this is the net pumping in the upper basin and the lower basin in the valley with CYHWRMS and no growth. But maybe there's another option. Maybe there could be a downward trend in pumping over time. Nobody's talking about that too much. I don't think it's super expected that we could grow the population and reduce consumption. You never know. There are possible interventions, and someone asked me about recharge. I mean, that's one of the things on my list here is artificial recharge. Certainly that is being done in a lot of places. I'm just going to run through a quick review of what kinds of things can be done. We all know that indoor water use is a good area for conservation. Linda Stitzer can talk a lot about techniques for conservation in the household. We have a lot of leaking toilets and leaking faucets in older homes that can be fixed. This is Jody. No, just kidding. If you're from Iowa and you moved here when you were 50 and decided that you always ran the water in the sink when you were brushing your teeth in Iowa, and you might as well not change now, you could save 5 gallons per toothbrushing by just turning off the spigot. These are simple things. You could get a better toilet. So this is pretty common. The purple pipes signify treated effluent that is used to replace potable groundwater in irrigating things like parks and golf courses. Very common practice in Tucson. Pretty expensive to retrofit some areas, especially not very densely populated areas, but that's an option. Increasing water costs is an excellent way to affect this kind of change. Once you pay a little more for every drop you send down the sink for no reason, you quickly get the grip that maybe you shouldn't be doing that. So there are other options like water banking, trading, and leasing that I know some people in this room are working on. This is a graphic from the state of Idaho, but there's a lot of water market interconnections here between farmers, the environment, the legal system, and hydrology and water management. All these things have to come together to support basically legal transfers of water from an area of supply to an area of an interested user who has demand. That can involve a lot of expensive infrastructure, either recharge basins or pipelines and pumps and all kinds of things. And then it, of course, involves some sort of legal mechanism, which we don't have a lot of in Arizona right now. Irrigation efficiency is an easy target in a lot of areas. If you have an open ditch, sometimes it could be piped, or if you have, open air irrigation, it could be converted to drip irrigation. This is well known in the valley here. Xeriscaping is another popular option for just eliminating, or very coming close to eliminating irrigation. Rainwater harvesting, I think you asked me about this earlier. That's just simply the concept of capturing water from impervious surfaces inside an urban area, saving it for some other time. So instead of letting it go into this, I'll say that's a rock lawn, not a grass lawn, but instead of just running off and evaporating, it could be stored here and used for your xeriscaping later. This is a picture of a curb cut in Tucson, Arizona. So storm water is running down the street, and instead of just running down the street and eroding everything in its path downstream, it actually takes a little side trip into this basin where it supplies water to nice desert landscaping along the road. Recharge can come in various ways, but here's just a picture of what an injection well looks like conceptually. You have to have some source of water somewhere that you pipe to a place, and you either inject it into the ground via a well, and that boosts up the water table and can help support the stream, or you can just put it in at the surface in what are called recharge basins, like in Avra Valley, Arizona. These are just surface basins where they rotate through, fill up one basin at a time, and sometimes let some dry out. So they just have this constant cycle of water going into the ground. You're losing some water through evaporation as well.
Evaporation is a big problem there, isn't it? What's the point?
Yeah, well, hopefully evaporation losses are not happening as rapidly as infiltration is happening. You have to have the right combination. So just to wrap things up, I have no idea what time it is, but we're coming to an end here. So I want to leave you with just some thoughts about your future. we saw what it looks like to have a high water use future. And I would put both of these scenarios in a relatively high water use future. Even no growth, there's a lot of water being used here, and it will have impacts on the river systems in the future. But for sure, we know either way, some wells are going to go dry and will have to be moved. And I know Arizona Water Company is concerned about issues like this. Municipalities who own their own water companies are very concerned. This is not a trivial issue. Sometimes land is an issue, land availability for a new well. Of course, the cost of abandoning a well and drilling a new one are very high. And then there's pipe transmission costs for a new well. So the Verde River and most of its tributaries in the valley will be impacted by pumping. We can say that truthfully, kind of no matter what happens in either one of these scenarios, you're going to see some impacts. Expensive mitigation like artificial recharge, water transfers may be needed to meet the demand in the future, as well as sustaining natural flows. You can't have it both ways for free. If you want to sustain a flowing river the way it's flowing today, you're going to have to do something special, some intervention to keep that from happening if you still continue to pump. The option is a lower water use future, right? So you can continue to pump a lot and have a high water use future, but it's going to cost a lot of money to keep a river flowing in those circumstances. If you simply reduce water use, and we heard a lot of good suggestions this morning, a lot of things happen. You can go from the CYHWRMS future to the no growth future simply by reducing GPPD. Okay? Every single person's gallon per use per day number can come down and eliminate those changes in the difference between those two curves. This means you have fewer new wells required. You may pay higher water rates to start with because that's how people get motivated to take action. But in the end, the cost of drilling new wells, maintaining new wells, putting new electrical connections and wiring and pipelines, all that is very, very expensive. So the options might be a lot more expensive than just paying a little more for water rates today. The other thing you get is a long delay. I won't say an elimination of, but a long delay in the perceived impacts of pumping on the rivers. So the slower you pump, the longer it takes for that impact to happen. It buys you a lot of time. And in that time, maybe efficiencies can improve even more. And finally, a lot of communities are very concerned about controlling their resources, their own resources within their communities into the future. And in a scenario where there's a lot of transfers and expensive infrastructure and water moving around all over the place, it gets harder and harder to control your resources. If you keep it in the ground underneath you, you know you have access to it into the future. So it's a good incentive for providers to try to protect their infrastructure that they have today. Okay, I think that is the end. Okay.